Okay, good evening everybody. I wanted to talk about the Pompeo hearings and Parshas Acharei Mos Kedoshim, which is this week's Torah reading. I find it to be quite hard to believe, to say the least. This Senator Booker, this is a man who has the audacity to challenge Pompeo on his religious beliefs. When Cory Booker, when he was in Cambridge, right? One of those places in England. He would hang out all the time at the Chai Society when Shmuley Boteach was the rabbi of the Chai Society in Cambridge or Oxford, one of them. I don't know. Now, Cory Booker can say a Dvar Torah like he sounds like an NCSY kid, you know. He sounds like a regular Orthodox Jew when he can speak, even though he's African American. He's not Jewish. Not that doesn't mean you can be Jewish, but you can't. There are plenty of African American Jews, but it happens that Cory Booker is not Jewish, but he can talk like an Orthodox Jew better. He can talk like a Jew better than most Jews. And did he ever ask them these type of questions that he's asking Senator Pompeo? It boggles the mind. But Congressman Pompeo, whatever, and he was, he's supposed to be the next Secretary of State. This is the oldest and probably most prestigious cabinet position, Secretary of State. It's never been challenged like this before, and just over crazy, weird things, just basically because the Democrats don't like Donald Trump, and it's like mind-boggling, because here's a perfectly valid candidate, but the types of questions that Cory Booker was asking are just, I think it crosses a line. The law says that the Constitution says there should be no religious test for any office, and that goes both ways. It's not, people think no religious test means, all right, you don't have to be an Anglican to be, something, you don't need to be Episcopalian. It's, but it's the same thing. Except one is, in England and one is in other countries. But, and that's basically what it means. But it also means, you don't have to be an atheist. You can't be tested on. Bernie Sanders did the same thing. It's totally illegal and unconstitutional what the Democrats are doing as far as religious tests. But the better question is, because Senator Booker was asking this, does Mr. Pompeo believe that homosexual sex is a sin? Now, I don't know what that has to do with his position as Secretary of State. I don't understand how does that even come into the radar of doing his job as Secretary of State? But as many people on the radio pointed out, I mean, just because someone believes something is a sin doesn't mean that they hate people who engage in that sin. Doesn't mean that they believe that, as is practiced in some religions, in some countries today, like do they believe that, people who commit this sin should be executed, should be mistreated? That's a valid question. But do you believe that it's a sin? I don't even understand how does that even come into the radar of the question of confirming someone as the Secretary of State. I don't know. What does that have to do with his job as the Secretary of State? With that being said, I would like to get into, this is an issue that I've been afraid to make a YouTube video about it. I touched on it recently in a YouTube video. And, on one hand, I saw in Proverbs, it says, when you're getting into a fight that's not yours, it's like, playing with a dog's ears. The dog is going to bite you. Like, don't even talk about this. It's not that important. And I can agree, but on the other hand, I do believe that there are certain important things that should be expressed and brought out vis-a-vis this question of someone being someone's religious beliefs, and whether or not holding a particular religious belief makes one bigoted. It has to do with a lot of the questions today, which no longer are in the realm of tolerance for people who engage in certain activities that certain people might believe to be sinful and certain other people might not believe to be sinful. It's a whole different realm of, you have to accept this, you have to believe that this is okay. And the crazy thing is that Cory Booker has always been very friendly to the Orthodox Jewish community, which absolutely believes that these actions are sinful. But I think, talking about this, I wanted to bring up a totally different, and to most people will sound totally radical idea, to explain the biblical text, for sure from the prospect of the Hebrew Bible, but even really, although arguments could be made vis-a-vis the Christian Bible, what Christians call the New Testament, there is a striking truth of Scripture that people should be aware of. When discussing this issue of sexual orientation, there is no such concept in the Bible of sexual orientation. Neither positive nor negative. This is not a concept that enters into the biblical mindset and worldview. People might read it into it, but the fact of the matter is, it's not there. There is no such concept of sexual orientation, neither heterosexual nor homosexual, anywhere in the Bible. And I'm willing to argue that fact. Now, I've heard arguments claiming that the concept does exist, but none of them really approach it in the sense of how it's understood today in the West, that this is a type of person. And I say that because it's a very striking point vis-a-vis the way the Western world views the question of sexual orientation today. It's a concept that's totally not biblical. And there are other aspects of how questions of heterosexuality and homosexuality are addressed in the parlance of the West that are not biblical. And I believe that a lot of ideas that people have, people who claim the Bible to be their source of authority, a lot of their ideas are clouded by this Western concept, this modern concept, this really new concept of sexual orientation that really did not exist really that much in most ancient cultures. It might have existed in certain ancient cultures, but for the most part, it didn't exist. The main point I want to bring out is there is no word, there is no noun to describe a person who engages in homosexuality or a person who prefers homosexuality in classical Hebrew. In modern Hebrew, they just use, the English words, homo, gay, whatever. They don't have these words in classical Hebrew. It's certainly not in biblical Hebrew, but also not in Talmudic and rabbinical Hebrew. This concept doesn't exist. Anytime it's being described in more modern rabbinical literature, you need to have like a whole sentence, a whole phrase to describe this, because it's a concept that is not found in any biblical text, any rabbinical text. Not to say that homosexuality is not discussed in the Bible or in the Talmud. Of course it's discussed, but it's never labeled. That's a tremendous statement. The importance of that statement cannot be understated. That a person who engages in homosexuality has no label in biblical Hebrew. In Greek, in Koine Greek, you do have in the Christian Bible, what Christians call the New Testament, you do have statements that describe people who engage in homosexual acts, but they do not have words to describe a person who has a preference for homosexuality over heterosexuality. You only have a noun describing the person being engaged in the act. So again, you don't have this concept of a gay person, of a homosexual person, the way we have in the modern sense. You only have the concept of a word to describe a person who is actively engaging or passively engaging in such an act. That you don't have in Hebrew. In Hebrew, you don't have any word like that. And that's not to say nouns don't exist in Hebrew. Nouns to describe people who engage in certain acts don't exist. They absolutely exist in Hebrew. I'm not going to get into the exact words in Hebrew, but we can, But, in English, you have such a thing, a person who engages in plumbing is a plumber, a person who engages in teaching is a teacher, right? A person who, or when it comes to crimes and sins, a person who engages in theft is a thief, and robbery is a robber. A person who engages in murder is a murderer. Someone who engages in ritzicha is a rotzeach, right? Someone who engages in murder is a murderer. Someone who engages in geneva is a ganav. Who engages in robbery is a robber. Who engages in gazela is a gosler. Who engages in theft is a thief. Someone, even someone who commits sexually immoral acts, diuf is a menayef, is a noyef, is an adulterer. There are words like this, but there is no word in Hebrew for someone who engages in homosexuality at all. There is no concept of a person who prefers homosexuality to heterosexuality anywhere. The only thing that we have in the Talmud is that there are discussions of who is suspected of engaging in this, who should you be worried about, men being alone with men, children being alone with men, things, and that is widely a societal issue. Some people have said that it's a racial issue. It's not. I've heard people say that. It's not. It's a societal issue, meaning in ancient Greece, and most of ancient Greek culture, homosexual sex was totally normative. That's not to say that the men who engaged in homosexual sex didn't engage in heterosexual sex as well. They did both. That was the norm in ancient Greece. In ancient Israel, since it was so discouraged, it was not the norm. Things developed because of how the culture engaged in the things, and people. It would seem, and Maimonides certainly points this in other areas, the question of nature versus nurture. When it comes to this question, that this would be an issue of nurture and not nature. And that being said, you do hear these terms of things being unnatural and so forth in Western society. This is an unnatural form, this is a natural form. And the fact of the matter is that really, that is not something that you really find in the biblical narrative, nor that much really in the rabbinical literature. It's never stated that this form of sex is natural, this form of sex is unnatural. What's stated in the Talmud and in the Bible is this form is permitted, this form is even encouraged, and this form is prohibited, this form is sinful. And it's not a matter of natural or unnatural, because it seems pretty obvious from nature and from the text that sex is totally natural. And when Scripture tells us these are the standards to live by, it's not saying this is natural, this is unnatural. It's saying if you're part of this covenant, you're expected to hold yourself to a higher standard. You're expected not to live a natural life, but to live a supernatural life. And if you mess up, you're expected to recognize that if you committed a sin, it's a sin, and not try to say this is okay to do. And now that's not to say that we should discriminate against people based on these issues. No. In the biblical times, was there a concept that that at least a particular form was liable to the death penalty? Well, yes and no. We have to understand how the death penalty worked according to the rabbis. Is that necessarily biblically sound? I believe it is, although there were some solo scriptura groups that were much more quick to administer capital punishment. The Sadducees would engage in capital punishment much more commonly than the quote-unquote Pharisees, than the rabbis. The Sadducees would insult by calling them Pharisees, and the rabbis themselves would call certain other groups Pharisees. But that being said, the Pharisees abstained from capital punishment as well. They were very careful about capital punishment, and they tried to discourage capital punishment as much as possible. Unlike the Sadducees, who said, it's in the Bible, we gotta stone these people, even if, the Sadducees, the quote-unquote Pharisees, the rabbis, generally their approach was as follows. First of all, the Bible says very clearly, according to 2 witnesses is a thing established. And that applies to capital punishment as well. Meaning, you cannot have a capital case without 2 valid witnesses. And the rabbis then would go out of their way to say they had very strict rules about who qualifies as a witness. And so, that being the case, capital punishment was almost non-existent in the Pharisee tradition. The rabbis of the Talmud say, they're talking in an era when capital punishment was already banned. But they said if a court would execute once in 7 years, they were chavlanis, they were destructive. That was one opinion. And then the second opinion said, no, once in 70 years was destructive. And then the third opinion went back and said, if I lived in a time when they still had capital punishment, I would have abolished capital punishment. To which the other rabbis answered, no, you have to at least have it on the books as a deterrent against murder. Because if you abolish capital punishment, then you're going to increase murder. And so we have to have capital punishment on the books, even if we never use it. But it's the fact that it's still on the books, and very rarely, once in a while, we use it, will serve enough as a deterrent against murder. But when it came to other capital crimes, like Sabbath desecration, sexual crimes, and so forth, it was pretty much unheard of, particularly with sexual crimes, for an execution to ever actually be administered, because first of all, in order to administer an execution, you have to have two valid witnesses, and the witnesses have to explain to the person, you understand that by virtue of doing this, committing this sin, you are liable to the death penalty and you have to cite chapter and verse. According to the rabbis, according to Sadducees, they would just stone people, and burn people at the stake and do crazy things like that. But according to the rabbinical, the quote-unquote Pharisees, it was more or less just something that was on the books that was never actually practiced, because the rabbis taught you have to have witnesses, and the witnesses have to warn you ahead of time that you're committing a capital sin and so forth. And then if you do the sin by accident, you have to bring a sin offering. If various things, you didn't know, whatever, things like this. It was not that people would actually be executed. However, obviously, the sins were still discouraged. That didn't mean that people were allowed to sin wantonly, and sometimes, the rabbis had discretion to enforce these laws, if not by capital punishment, sometimes by corporal punishment, sometimes by imprisonment, other things like that. If they saw that people were not following the laws, and they also were not legally liable to the death penalty. But all these things have to be considered, that they were not executing people for committing these sins, because you never had witnesses for these. These are the types of things that happen in private when God forbid they happen. So therefore, they weren't executing people for these things, because there were no witnesses, and if someone was watching this going on, it would pretty much disqualify them from being a witness, because it's sinful to sit and watch something like this going on. Now, there could be cases where they say, well, we were witness that these two people went to a secluded place together, things like that. But it seems pretty obvious to me that from a natural state, human beings would be viewed as what they call today in the modern parlance pansexual. People will have sex with whatever they can. It's just that on a natural state, it's just that hopefully they're raised in a society that teaches them, well, this is inappropriate, and all right, so each society will, decides basically, what do they consider appropriate, what do they not consider appropriate, under what circumstances. And so we live in a more permissive society that has gone away from the biblical standards. But I'm talking here of nature versus nurture, meaning that the nurture is developed because someone is raised in a biblical society, in a society that sees the Bible as being authoritative, and so therefore, and if the people actually take it seriously, even though there are plenty of societies that claim to take the Bible seriously that really don't follow these type of things, But even that being said, is that really being hypocritical, or is that just recognizing that human beings are human beings, and sometimes people sin, but at least to have a standard and to recognize I really shouldn't be doing this is a standard. But the point that I'm saying here is that absolutely there is no biblical mandate to say that, we should treat people differently in society because they engage in a particular sin or so forth, and either positively or negatively, meaning, and particularly meaning that this idea of preference, that a person might prefer one thing over another, that doesn't even come into the picture of the Bible. That's just not an idea that's a biblical idea. That's not to say biblically we should ignore this concept, or that it's okay, that it's permissive. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying this to be permissive. What I am saying is that you don't define a person as a different category on this, for positive or for negative. Meaning we have this phenomenon in America that now all of a sudden you're a protected class because for whatever reason, whether it's nature or nurture, and it's been ingrained into you, whatever it is, that a person feels a proclivity to one thing or another, or to many things, or whatever it is, that now therefore they're a protected class. I also don't believe that that's biblically sound, but rather, like we said, just the value of the individual. I mean, we treat human beings as human beings with respect, no matter what they are, no matter what they do, no matter what they believe, and in the modern society. And so therefore, if you want to take a biblical approach, so then the biblical approach would be, there is no such thing as these labels that we have. They just don't, they're not part of what the Bible's talking about. We don't have these ideas in the Bible. But again, all we have in the Bible is, yes, there is the belief in the Bible that this action is sinful, but the fact of the matter is people do engage in that. Even people who are religious engage in it. My approach would be more or less to say, the question should be approached like this, how do we treat, let's say in a particular synagogue, how do we treat people who drive to synagogue on Saturday? That's also a capital sin. Certain synagogues, you're not going to be counted in a minyan. You're not going to be allowed, and so therefore it's not hypocritical, therefore, that if someone is open about committing one of these sins, to treat them differently, it's totally in line. Other synagogues, they look the other way, or they say, all right, technically we don't condone this action, but we're not going to treat you differently because of that. And so therefore, to be fair, it should be the same thing. And then when it comes to people who, whether it's an open secret or not, there are certain people who they drive to synagogue on Sabbath, and everyone knows they live too far away from synagogue to walk, but they have enough decency that they'll park a couple blocks away and walk the rest of the way, mostly just because they're embarrassed. They know they're not supposed to drive on Saturday. They know it's wrong. Technically, according to Jewish law, when someone's on that level, even if everybody, there could be question, but in general, that's how it's generally accepted, although there are different views. Some people will say, no, if everybody knows that this person lives too far away from the synagogue and they know that this person is driving, there's no question about it, we should treat them as a Sabbath violator. But there is the concept of what's considered Mechal Shabbos for Hesia. And the same thing could be with these issues, even if someone knows, quote unquote, but this person is ashamed of it and they try to hide it. I would say that there certainly is a biblical mandate against what we call in America today the pride movement. To be prideful in sin is definitely unbiblical. Even if everybody knows about it, even if it's like an open secret, and everybody knows, yeah, so-and-so does these things. But as long as they're somewhat ashamed of it, they're not waving a banner, look at me, this is what I do, they should be treated like everybody else. I don't think there's, not to say that it's okay. It's not okay. But people do these things. People have difficulties. Everybody has their issues with their struggles. But even so, if you're in a synagogue that treats people who park in the parking lot on Saturday, and they're totally not ashamed, and that person could be on the Chevra Kadisha and could be the Gabbai of the shul and all this stuff. And so why would you treat somebody like this differently? Why is this sin different than that sin? But that doesn't mean that we therefore say it's no longer a sin. That's the point I want to bring out here to Cory Booker, is that someone can 100% believe that something's a sin and engage in the sin, or not engage in the sin but overlook the sin, or be tolerant to people who even are open about the sin. People who are prideful of the sin. You don't have to. You can still be totally tolerant of them as people and treat them as human beings with the same respect that all human beings deserve for being created in the image of God. And just because they engage in a particular sin, certainly if they're ashamed of it, but even if they're prideful of it, that's not a reason to treat someone to be disrespectful of someone. Just because of this. It's especially if they're raised in a society where they don't know any better. Especially if they're brought up in a society where they believe that's, we already have this phenomenon in the world where you have second, third, fourth generation people, that are raised in this idea, it's, to me, it's very strange. It doesn't sit well with me to see, like Mardi Gras became in Australia this pride event, and I saw something recently with little kids, talking about, and I was like, it doesn't sit well with me to bring the kids into this stuff. But I understand where they're coming from, and I understand, it could be approached in an appropriate way, but that doesn't mean to say that someone who believes differently is a bigot. This is what we have to bring out. Tolerance works both ways. As long as I'm not saying, the stories with the cakes, with baking the cakes. If someone says, we don't serve your kind round here, all right, that is a violation of civil rights. Although I personally believe that should be legal, and if someone's that stupid that they don't want someone's business, it's the business owner's loss. But if you have laws against discrimination like that, it's fair to say if someone says, we don't serve gay people here, that would fit under the law. But if someone says, I don't make a cake for a marriage between two men under any circumstances, or I don't do any service at a marriage ceremony between two men, really, the way people identify today, you could say, well, there are two men who identify as straight. In the biblical parlance, there's no such thing as heterosexual as straight either. People are just people, as far as this question is concerned. Maybe not other questions, but as far as this question is concerned, there's no biblical concept of gay and straight. The concept doesn't exist in the Bible, doesn't exist in any rabbinical literature, and doesn't exist in most Christian literature until modern days. These concepts were just not. That doesn't mean that people didn't engage in these activities. It just means that you weren't categorized as a different type of person, and therefore neither to be discriminated against nor to be held up. Now, people are going to say, what are you talking about? There were laws against sodomy, laws against it. A law against sodomy is not a discrimination against a particular type of person because it's equally applied across the board. And so to here. Now, personally, I think it was wrong that Alan Turing was arrested because of this. I absolutely believe that's wrong. I think that's unfair and so forth, and it was a very sad story that happened to him. I don't support that in the modern days today. Now, if someone commits an act against someone's will or to someone who doesn't have the capacity for consent, then that's a crime, no matter if you're dealing with a man or a woman. And that includes, in prison populations, even consenting adults, quote unquote, among inmates is illegal, and I think that's proper and right. But as far as people who are on a level playing field and they're consenting adults, that's between them and God. And God will judge them, and God created them. God knows. I personally believe that God is very merciful, but particularly when people are humble and admit that they're sinful and they're not trying to undermine society, but they're struggling with an issue, with an addiction, or whatever they're struggling with, that's a different story. And everybody, what did one of the early church fathers say? Hate the sin but love the sinner. Which it's echoed in the words of the rabbis, how they somewhat reinterpret, Psalm 104 to say that sins should be removed from the earth, and the way they translate it means sins and not sinners. The sinners should repent, or they should turn around, or they should at least admit and confess their sins and try to be better. At least admit that they are sinners, and that opens up the heart to God, to recognize you're not smarter than God. But despite that, yes, I think about it like this, and I've said this before, if you have, in the Jewish religion, eating pork is a sin for a Jew. It's not considered a sin for a Gentile to eat pork, as opposed to aspects of this sin that we're talking about are, according to Jewish law, prohibited for Gentiles as well, but we're not going to get into that right now. But to be intellectually honest, that's true. But for a Jew, to eat pork is a sin. But that's not to say, so let's say like this. Let's say you have two Jewish people. One, he eats pork, but he knows it's a sin. And when it comes to Yom Kippur, he beats his chest and he says, God, please help me to overcome this. I know it's wrong, but I can't help myself. That person is a regular sinner like any other sinner. People are sinners. Doesn't mean people are evil. It just means they're sinners. It means they missed the mark. It means they're not perfect. Nobody's perfect. But if you have a person who doesn't like to eat pork, he thinks it's gross, but he doesn't think it's a sin. He's a Reformed Jew. He's like, that's old-fashioned ideas to believe this and that sin. I don't like to eat pork, and it's my tradition not to eat pork or whatever. But is it actually a sin to eat pork? I don't believe that nonsense. That person's a heretic, which is much worse, according to the eyes of Judaism. Again, we're not burning heretics at the stake in the Jewish world. But the same thing is here, I would say, with this issue. Someone who engages in this sin, but he knows it's wrong, and he's humble, and he asks God, forgive me. Even if he's decided, I'm not even going to try to stop, but he recognizes that it's wrong. That's already a level. Obviously, it's better if he tries to stop, even if he doesn't stop, and obviously better if he stops. But not everybody's ready for that. It's very difficult. People have difficulties, and they have to have compassion and empathy for people who are struggling. But then on the other hand, there could be a person who says, I'm not interested in that. That doesn't appeal to me. But I don't believe that's a sin. Come on. This is the 21st century. That's already, heresy. That's already crossed the line. Again, does that mean that necessarily we have to be activists, this and that. That has to be questions that everyone has to ask. They have to have their own rabbinical leadership type of question. Can you vote for a candidate that supports this idea? Now it's too late. It's already the law of the land, But before, I was always very troubled by why was the rabbinical establishment supporting Andrew Cuomo. And the answer is because he was going to win without the Jews anyway. So they were pretty much stuck. If you have a very visible voting bloc, you're stuck voting for him, or else he's going to take his revenge because he knows you didn't vote for him. That's really what it's about. And it's unfortunate. That's part of Gullus. That's part of our exile. But even to the point where there were Orthodox members of the state assembly who were in support of this, that I think is disgusting and is wrong. But again, I remember David Weprin came to a shul where I was a rabbi for one year. I was a rabbi in a shul, and David Weprin came to the shul, and he's an Orthodox Jew, and he was supporting this. And I gave him the lead. I let him lead benching. I didn't treat him differently just because he voted in support of something that I feel was wrong approach for an Orthodox Jew to take a public stance on. And even if someone, I'm not saying that he does, but I'm saying even if someone privately engages in this, that's a different story. What's private and what's public are two different things. And I think these are, by and large, private issues that should not be major public issues, and that's another aspect of this that we have to discuss. So that's basically what I wanted to bring out here to explain a little bit what the text actually says, because the text does not invent a word to describe the person who engages in this. It just says, don't do it. That's it. It doesn't say why. It doesn't say this. It just says toeva he. Toeva is usually translated as abomination. Although the rabbis often say toeba. You're making a mistake in it. You're lost in this. Meaning, a lot of how, especially the Kabbalists, understand, by and large, a lot of these sexual sins, how they're described in the Bible. Like, for example, incest, it says chesed hu. And the word chesed means kindness and love. But it's translated as it's immoral, it's disgusting, it's degrading. However you want to, I forget how King James, translates it's lewdness. I think zima is lewdness. I forget chesed. It's similar to like an abomination. But this is a word that means love and kindness. And so the point is that what it is that people are misplacing their love. They're using what is a proper type of love in a wrong way. It's not rooted in something evil. It's rooted in something good that's being used in an evil way, which in a way is maybe a bit more insidious. It's more dangerous but again, that's how quite often the Yetzer Hara works. Quite often the desire and lust that people have will fool a person to believing that what he's doing is actually good. And so we're saying to'eva means to'eba. You're making a mistake in this. You're lost in this. But your heart's in the right place, but your actions you're taking it the wrong way. But again, I didn't really want to get into this subject. But the main point I want to bring out was this about, the way Cory Booker is approaching this, I think is absolutely abhorrent. To register a religious test like this for a government appointment is it's totally inappropriate. It's much more inappropriate than anything for his position, and he knows better, and he engages with people who believe like this, and I feel that it's a bigotry against traditional Christians. The same thing I saw recently, someone was like, oh, how dare Chick-fil-A dare to open in New York City? What does that mean? Why can't we accept traditional Christians? If we have to accept, and the thing is you have, again, and I'm very accepting of traditional Muslims, but you do have radical Muslims who, in certain countries, they will kill people for engaging in the sin, even though it's quite a common sin in the Muslim world. But for being open about what, I don't know, what the, and, where's the outcry against that? But somehow, tolerance has to be a two-way street. I'm not saying to tolerate people who actually kill people who do these things. But it is possible to be tolerant of someone who believes that an action is a sin, but doesn't treat, as long as they don't treat people differently on that account. And particularly in Christianity, that focuses so much on the fact that all human beings are sinners. That's a primary concept of Christianity. There's no reason for Christians to treat people differently because they're sinners. Because a primary concept of Christianity is we're all sinners. We all fall short. And we need salvation. In Judaism, we also believe that we're all sinners, but there is a concept in Judaism that you should not believe yourself to be evil. And Maimonides explains that if a person thinks, and I remember this when I was a kid, I was like, someone who was brought up in a Christian ideology, but didn't quite understand the theology behind Christianity. He said, well, we're all going to hell anyway, so what difference does it make? Just eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. And that's a problem, So you shouldn't think yourself to be evil. All right. Thank you for watching. God bless. Please like, share, subscribe, comment, all the best.